Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. The climate crisis is increasingly serious, even though most politicians don't want to deal with it, and mainstream media fail to report on it adequately. Perhaps they think it's old news. This month's TV program will bring us up to date on the worsening crisis about the global climate, and we'll also evaluate several strategies for making progress. I'm happy to welcome two guests who are exceptionally well informed, Doug Howell from the Sierra Club and Casey Golden from Climate Solutions. Welcome, I'm glad you're here.
Thanks for having us, Glenn.
The term global warming might sound pleasant to people who've been experiencing winter weather here, but the climate crisis is really a lot more disruptive than a pleasant-sounding term like global warming. Can you just summarize what the climate crisis is and what causes it?
Sure. I think the simplest way to talk about climate change from the science aspect is that what is happening is with the expansion of greenhouse gas emissions creates exactly that, a greenhouse gas effect. So it traps more heat from the sun. So as that sun infuses more heat into the earth, this perfectly balanced ecosystem has to find something to do with it. So it has to disperse this energy, and that's one area where people most relate to it. In all the wacky weather, the extreme weather that we're now seeing, is a result of the earth having to find ways to dissipate an extra level of energy that it's never had for hundreds of thousands and even millions of years. It's similar to our body, a perfectly balanced ecosystem at 98.6 degrees. If you increase our temperature by 1 degree, you might be feeling a little bit off. Well, we've done that with the Earth. Imagine now your body having 2 degrees or 3 degrees, and very soon you understand that's not sustainable. That is exactly the direction we're headed with climate change, by infusing more energy into an ecosystem that's just not used to it.
So it disrupts like the jet stream, so somebody gets somebody else's weather, and somebody's too hot, somebody's too cold, somebody gets a drought, somebody else gets horrible rains. It's a disruption.
It is absolutely a disruption, and it occurs in many, many ways. You can see these unprecedented droughts that you saw in China and Afghanistan, these unprecedented heat wave and forest fires that we had in Russia a couple years ago, the heat wave in Europe. Katrina is our own backyard example. Yeah. And this is one of the things that we're going to be seeing as a result of climate change and climate disruption, is greater extreme weather that we just haven't had. The 100-year flood will become the 10-year flood. And this is the kind of catastrophic changes that we see most immediately. But then we have these more global trends of loss of fresh water across the globe, decreasing snowpack in all our major river feeder systems. So for example, whether it would be in the Andes or whether it would be in the Himalayas that feed some of our primary freshwater systems, as that snowpack begins to reduce, so do the water systems that it feed. And these are some of the long-term effects that are going to be absolutely catastrophic.
Yeah. And Glenn, you started out by noting that global warming is sort of an ironic and in some ways unfortunate term for it. It accurately describes the trend in the global average temperature, but nobody lives in the global average temperature, right? Disruption is actually a much more apt word, and even closer to home than Doug mentioned. The unprecedented flooding over the last 5 or 6 years, even in the Chehalis River, close to here, the loss of snowpack in the Cascades, the forest health crisis on the east side of the Cascades, where you're seeing millions of acres of forest dying off that results in forest fires. All of those are conclusively linked to global warming and give you a little bit of the local flavor for what it looks like.
And the process will feed on itself once we pick up like 2 degrees Celsius, which would be like about 3 degrees Fahrenheit. The scientists say we've got to keep it below that. What happens scientifically, what would happen if we get beyond just a couple degrees of change?
The concept here, I think you're referring to, is what they call the tipping point. There are points at which that it becomes catastrophic. One example of which is there is this one scenario where the jet stream, the Gulf jet stream that works its way to Europe and Northern Europe, if we have a greater heat, we could have a greater infusion of fresh water off of all the ice from Greenland and the greater dropping of rain. That fresh water comes in North America, and then it suppresses the saltwater conveyor belt. So it no longer crosses across the Atlantic to Northern Europe. It goes south. That becomes, it's no longer Ireland. You have to change that R to a C, and it becomes Iceland. And so you have some of these disruptions that are absolutely catastrophic. You have another type of disruption where you have these feedback loops that feed upon themselves. When you open up the tundras in North America and in Canada and in Russia, you have this release of methane when all these bogs come out. Mm-hmm. Methane is 22 times more powerful than carbon dioxide, the primary greenhouse gas. So then you're accelerating the global warming and climate crisis effects. So you have to be very careful of getting to this tipping point where you have these cycles of no return.
Yeah, but then that leads some folks, I think, to ask the question, well, are we already past the point of no return? And I think it's important, while acknowledging that scientifically that's right, there are these thresholds in the system. Nobody knows exactly where they are. All we know is the more we do today to implement solutions, the better off we're going to be. So I think sometimes people look at this and say, well, is it too late? Is it time yet? It's not too late. It's not too early. Now is the perfect time to be doing everything we can.
Yeah,
and that's all we can do.
And if we fail to do that, we know we're going to make it worse.
Exactly.
And just bring on all the various catastrophes and so forth. It has implications for national security and global security as well. I wonder if somebody could just mention briefly how the things connect.
Well, certainly we know that our Defense Department did this calculation many years ago about what would be the global stressors from a loss of all these natural resources across the world. There'll be massive migration out of these countries that are losing fresh water and natural resources, and that will be exacerbating global tensions. And so there is just the underlying concern about reducing necessary human resources to survive that will be diminished, and therefore accelerating and exacerbating some of these global tensions we already see.
Yeah. So if the global climate chaos causes a drought in some area, and millions of people can't feed themselves, and they have to move someplace else, then all of a sudden they're now in conflict with this other population that's been living in the new location, and then you have a war happening, or you have more catastrophe because you can't sustain that big a population, and everything is connected. I mean, that's one of the basic principles of environmentalism is we all realize everything is connected, and I think the peace movement understands this too. So if we don't take care of the environment, it's going to result in wars.
For at least a couple reasons. One is the physical disruptions you mentioned create movements of populations and tensions and that sort of thing. But I think it also is true in a political sense because it's a security issue in part because it's a justice issue, right? I mean, this is happening because of fossil fuel consumption. And overwhelmingly, the developed, relatively rich nations have burned most of the fossil fuels. But the impacts are going to fall first and worst on the people who've burned the least fossil fuels, the people who did the least to cause it, but don't have the resources to move to higher ground when the water comes up or figure out a new way to meet their food supplies. So that creates a real, I think, global justice crisis that then manifests itself as a security problem.
Yeah. So again, all of these things are linked. There are some people who are either denying that this is happening or denying that people are causing it. They're saying, oh, that's just the normal fluctuations, don't worry about it. The overwhelming majority of scientists, I mean a virtual consensus, says, no, this really is happening, and it really is fossil fuels that's doing it. And I keep thinking back decades ago when the public, like in the 50s and 60s, and the public was realizing, gee, tobacco is really harmful, and the tobacco companies found a couple of doctors that they could pay to say, well, we're not sure yet. The science really isn't settled about whether tobacco hurts you or not. And they were able to pretend like it's an undecided issue for science. And it was really in consensus, except for a few outliers.
It's a great analogy, and in fact, some of the very same message consultants that propagated that lie about tobacco are propagating the lies about fossil fuel use now. So it's a very good analogy, and it explains a lot about the denial and the misperception. I think it was Senator Moynihan who first said, we're all entitled to our own opinion, but we're not entitled to our own facts. And I will tell you that some of this is certainly because the fossil fuel companies are spending a lot of money to deceive people. But I think another thing that contributes to it is something that we can all take a little responsibility for. A woman said to us in a focus group once, it was the most enlightening thing I ever heard from communication research. She said, I don't think it's that big of an issue because nobody's doing anything about it.
Whoa.
And so it's sort of like, surely if it was as bad as Al Gore says, the responsible authorities would be declaring an emergency and doing something about it. And the fact that none of us, truly, certainly our government, many of us even in our own lives, are not treating this as the crisis and the emergency that it is confusing to people and reinforces that sense of denial.
Yeah, but it also exposes, or it's another data piece of showing what's wrong with how we run our political systems.
That's
when the oil companies and the coal companies and so forth can fund the campaigns, and they can pump millions of dollars into candidates who will spout the denial stuff, and then the news media, for fear of being called the liberal media, says, oh, well, we have to treat this as a balanced thing. So we have somebody who says, tobacco is bad for you, and we can find some doctor who will say, we don't know if tobacco is bad for you, so now it's undecided. We just report, you decide.
There was we were just talking about this a little bit earlier today, and I think there were a couple of things that with this denier phenomena that we think we're seeing, and it isn't this. The scientific community is really in accord on this, and it's been a very broad consensus internationally, the biggest collaboration on science you've ever had in the world. And so it's just you take the few rogue scientists that want to take it out of context, and I think that, and this may be jumping ahead a bit, but it really works here, is that what we really had a peak of understanding around 2005 when we did our polling. We had overwhelming belief that there was solid evidence about global warming and the need to do something. We ran about 90% with Democrats, 75% for Republicans. And then around 2005, as we're heading into a federal climate bill, it started to look like we might actually do something. And it was around that time we began to see a massive ramp up of funding of the fossil fuel industry on a couple of fronts, on lobbying, on doing disinformation campaigns, and they started spending a lot more money at the same time that we stopped doing the education that we were doing around the inconvenient truth. And that was a very bad confluence because it had a very big effect on public perception that was really unfounded. Fortunately, we're now beginning to see that to change again. And we're beginning to see people to commit again to understanding and recognizing the urgency of it.
Yeah, I was seeing public opinion polls showing that the public was becoming more skeptical, and then very lately I've been seeing some saying, a variety of public opinion polls showing the public is starting again to get the message, and it's not just the usual suspects, but when they break out, what do Republicans think, what do independents think, and so forth, they are realizing that this is a problem that needs. So I've been seeing mixed things, but more recently the public opinion polling seems to be headed back in the good direction.
I think that's right. I think it's pretty fluid. I will say there is another piece of this that is sort of more within our control. I think part of the reason that the denial story lives on long after the scientific evidence refuted it is the problem of scale. It's such a big problem. It's so out of scale with our own sense of our scope of effectiveness and how we solve problems that I think people are maybe more receptive than they should be to a story that says, well, maybe it's not that big of a problem. Maybe it's not really our fault. Maybe it's not our responsibility. It's a hard problem to take responsibility for if you don't see a hopeful, effective way to engage in solutions. It's almost like, gosh, I sure hope it's not real. If it's a problem that I don't feel effective in solving, and then it's a problem I'd rather not have. And so I think a lot of the solution is really engaging ourselves in solutions themselves, so that by becoming part of solving the problem, we've got a little bit more room in our hearts and brains for understanding what the problem's all about.
I think that's crucial. I think on a lot of issues, people feel powerless. People feel powerless to change our foreign policy, even though a majority wants peace, and we find governments keep ramping up new wars. And the people want to get big money out of politics, and the trend is the other way. And people just feel powerless, and then it's easy to give up. But I think we need to work with the kind of strategies you're talking about to empower ourselves again and make changes and move.
And when we have engaged, we've really made some great successes. We made great successes here about cleaning up our tailpipes by following the California standards. We passed the Renewable Portfolio Standard. I think we'll be touching on that later. We've made some very significant, meaningful. We have a transition date for our one and only coal plant. These 3 actions alone are significant reductions. So, when we do pull out of our shell and saying, oh, it's so big, and with just a modest amount more of effort from each of us individually, really can make this incredible political shift. So we're not that far away from being able to get to that place of being able to make big change.
And we just stopped the Keystone Pipeline, which everybody said was a done deal just a few months ago.
Yeah, it's tentatively stopped.
Yeah,
but we'll see what happens.
We may have to stop it again, but we stopped it once.
We stopped it once. That's a good precedent. I want to touch on one more downer, and then we'll look at some remedies, and then we'll do a lot of look at coal. In Kyoto, Japan, a number of years ago, when Clinton was president, there was a global conference on climate, and it got a lot of publicity, and they came up with a remedy, and the United States never ratified it. And then after Obama became president, there was a conference in Copenhagen, Denmark, that didn't really come up with much of anything, and the United States sort of squelched progress there, as I understand it. And then more recently we had in Durban, South Africa in December 2011, another one of these things. And the United States, again, and other big polluters tried to squelch progress. What a downer that is. I wonder if you could mention something of what's going on with that stuff and help us understand that.
Sure. I've been to a couple of those international meetings. I was in Copenhagen, and I went to the meeting when it was in Canada, in Montreal in 2005. These happen every year under the UN treaty. And you just can't say enough about what a big failure of responsibility it is for the United States to step up, join with the rest of the world as the nation that has contributed the most to this problem, as the nation that has the capacity to contribute the most to the solutions. The fact that we have not stepped up is an embarrassment. And as an American going to those meetings, you really feel the eyes of the rest of the world upon you. And they're determined, they're frustrated, they're not rejecting Americans. It's interesting. They're hopeful about what America could bring to the party, but they are desperately disappointed that we haven't stepped up in that way yet. The good news is they also know that in communities like Olympia, in the Puget Sound, in California, in a variety of places in the US, there are lots of Americans who are committed to solutions and are becoming part of the solution. And we've brought a lot of those state and local voices to those international meetings. And it's really given them a sense that although our federal government continues to fail us on this front, America, big parts of America, are committed to solutions and are going to meet them down the road.
Yeah, it seems like on a great number of issues, it's local level action that leads the way, and only after there's been enough of that, then does it become politically safe for the people on top to do it. State governments for decades have been sort of the experimental proving grounds of reforms and remedies that only later on get adopted nationally.
And that's where the action has now shifted. When we saw the demise at the international level, at the same time, shortly after that, and with all these continual international accords, we saw the failure at the federal level with our federal climate policy. And when that happened, the action really did shift back here at the states, and the states have been fabulous incubators, the local governments have, and that's really where we're seeing great action now on being the living solutions for how we can turn the corner on our fossil fuel dependence. So there's plenty of good examples out there. I do want to speak to the Kyoto thing and about where you wanted to talk about the downer of the drift, because I think there's a longer view here that would be useful for the public. And that is, we did a great job on education, about educating people about climate change, and it brought forth then this possibility of federal policy. And as that brought forth, then what we did is we really woke up the fossil fuel giant. And so while we really mastered the education side, now we're just at the front end of mastering the politics, because it is a David and Goliath. We are David, but we have the power of the people. But the Goliath that we're taking on has got massive amounts of money that they are now and seemingly unlimited coffers to spend that money to beat back the science and beat back the politics. But just like we won the war on the education, we will win that war on the politics, but we have to know we're at the front end, and it requires diligence to stay in the game.
Okay. One of the things that people have talked about as a remedy, cap and trade, where you set a limit, and then could you just briefly mention what that's about? I think that's not so workable. And when we were preparing for the program, you said, well, it's not all phony baloney. So tell us your take on it.
First of all, cap and trade is not one word, right?
Right.
A cap is simply a limit on total emissions. It is simply our commitment as a people to reduce our emissions to safe levels. That's what a cap is. A cap is a legal expression of that commitment to do what the science says we need to do. So one way or the other, we have to make that commitment. And when I think of what a cap is, a legal cap, that's just us using our laws and our institutions to express and enforce that commitment. So I think one way or the other, ultimately, we need a cap. We need a commitment to get emissions down to safe levels. That's the simple part. The trading part is whether once you establish that cap, the permits that are issued for people to emit up to that cap can be traded among people or not. I don't, that could be useful, it could be gamed, it could be disrupted in ways that wouldn't work. And so I get your skepticism about, gee, is somebody kind of moving the peas under the shells without doing anything? You gotta watch that. You gotta enforce it just like we enforce any of our laws now. Yes, people try to get around it, and yes, we got to be serious about the commitment and enforce it with the rule of law. But that basic underlying feature of whether we're going to have a legal commitment to a safe emissions level or not, we got to get over that hump.
There's one piece I'd like to point out about the cap and trade too, which is really interesting. About it, I think it kind of a little bit called the bluff of industry in some way in some businesses. The reason we took that approach is that business really liked that approach because it worked when we did the Clean Air Act amendments back in 1990 at the federal level. We used that for a sulfur trading program, the same concept of getting acid rain and sulfur dioxide emissions down. One guy could reduce it and sell the benefits to another industry that couldn't. It was efficient. It was economically efficient. It spoke the language of business, and business rallied behind it. So everybody rallied around this idea as being the business approach, but it also was the business world and corporate interests in fossil fuels specifically that killed this business model approach. So really when I say call the bluff, it's because they were unwilling to make this fundamental commitment about the cap.
Oh, okay. That's good insights there. Some years ago, the federal government started subsidizing corn ethanol as an alternative fuel so that we could drive our cars around as much as we want and not have to buy foreign oil. Corn ethanol, tell us about that.
Well, by and large, you end up producing just as much carbon as you would have if you had used gasoline. So the math doesn't work. The carbon math just ultimately doesn't work. And most of it was driven by the politics of the power of agricultural state senators and their economic constituencies. And it just wasn't a very analytically sound solution. That won't be the first of those that we'll see. Right. But I guess the other thing I would say about it is it's our responsibility to solve this problem. And I think for some of us in the environmental community, we grew up, I got into all this kind of work because I was a river guide and somebody wanted to dam my river and I wanted to stop them. And so a lot of what environmentalism has meant is that we have to prevent or stop or mitigate the adverse impacts of the way the economy works. That idea isn't big enough for solving climate change. Now what we have to do is build something fundamentally different. We can't just sand the rough edges off the fossil fuel economy and get to real climate solutions. We have to build a sustainable prosperity that runs on clean energy. And when we do that, we're going to make some mistakes. We're going to have some stupid ideas along the way. Not everything's gonna just come out of the box perfect, and we can't sit around sort of with our arms folded waiting for perfect solutions. So while I agree with you that corn ethanol was not a positive solution, I don't want to encourage people to be in the mode of saying, sort of looking under every rock for where's the scam. We got to be the people who invent this stuff, who promote it, who make some mistakes along the way, who learn from those mistakes and make better solutions going forward.
Well, I know one of the concerns that came from another angle on the corn ethanol thing is we've got a hungry world here, and people are starving to death while we were diverting huge amounts of corn to let us drive our gas guzzlers.
Absolutely
and that smacked the rest of the world wrong.
That points to another really important, I think, principle about where the good solutions are. Wasting less is by far the best solution. It's the cheapest, it's the best for the economy, it produces the most jobs, it produces the fewest unintended consequences, like competing with food. That doesn't mean to say that we can get all the way there by wasting less, but we can get a lot of the way there, and it's what we should really emphasize first and foremost.
One practical thing seems to be a carbon tax. Again, like to think about the world of business, send them a market solution. All right, the more carbon you burn, the more we tax you. Get it? Get it? Tell us about carbon tax.
It is like the cap and trade was founded in a kind of a business orientation to the problem, a business solution. I think all economists would agree that the most economically efficient way to globally get at the global climate crisis is to do a carbon tax. You go as far upstream as you can at the coal mine or the wellhead for natural gas or oil, you tax it there, and then the economy knows how to very efficiently send that price signal all the way down to the demand side, flipping the switch or filling your gas tank. And so from an efficiency perspective in a business model, that is the most efficient. But as you know, tax has become a four-letter word. And so in the political reality, it's just not there. I would like to build off of that, and I want to make a connection on some of the things you brought up as you quoted as being downers, that some of the Kyoto demise or the international negotiations, some of the polling trends, and, well, corn ethanol doesn't work. And you referred to it as a downer, and I want to say it now, and I hope we return to it. For those that have been following climate, some people have been despaired about it. You look at cap and trade, the possibility of a carbon tax, the international negotiations, maybe corn ethanol is not the way, and it isn't turning out to have the right math, and the numbers aren't there. People get a sense of despair. We know that as climate activists, when you've been slogging away at this for 20 years, as both Casey and I have, we know these moments, and I just want to say, and it's worth repeating throughout the show, the best way out of this sense of despair that we have with the global magnitude of this crisis is to get engaged with climate solutions, get engaged with Sierra Club. We are on the front lines of making the solutions real in the world, and if you really are despairing and you want to flip that, get engaged.
That's great. That's exactly, I think, that's, and that's kind of a recurring theme on this TV series. I mean, no matter what the problem is, it's all people power that's going to turn things around.
That's for sure.
We're running later than we had hoped because we want to get into coal pretty soon, which is a humongous issue. We want the government to create green jobs. There's another avenue that can either be done right or be done poorly. I want to mention something that both of you have been working on the voters in Washington State passed Initiative 937 in 2006 to reduce pollution and promote clean and affordable energy, electricity, and create jobs. And it's facing, I-937 is facing some struggles now as there's pushback from powerful interests in the state legislature. Tell us briefly about this, and then we can move on to some other.
Great.
It's our clean energy initiative in Washington. It was passed by the voters in 2006. And what it does is set a minimum clean energy standard that if you're a major utility delivering electricity in this state, you have to have a minimum amount of clean energy in the portfolio of resources that you're selling. So consumers know that our electricity supply is going to have at least that much clean energy in it. It's been extremely effective. It ramps up between now and 2020, so there's more and more clean energy in our energy supply. It requires utilities to help their consumers save energy whenever it's cheaper to save energy than to produce new energy, which is a lot of the time. And it's resulted in over $7 billion worth of investment in the Northwest clean energy industry. It's produced an enormous number of jobs. The energy efficiency part of it has produced tremendous savings to consumers. People don't know this. You talk about the clean energy story and people think of solar energy factories or what have you. The biggest part of the clean energy story, the biggest part of the whole energy story in the region over the last 20 years has been our energy savings programs. We have saved in the 4 Northwest states over 4,000 average megawatts of energy. That's enough to power the whole state of Idaho and the whole state of Montana. More than 4 cities the size of Seattle are now being powered by, being served by the energy we saved through these energy efficiency investments. That's by far the biggest thing that's happened on the energy front. And it saves consumers over $2 billion a year on our electricity bill in the 4-state region. So that's what 937 is about. Washington is a state where it's tricky to do statewide energy policy because we have so many different kinds of utilities with different circumstances, and any statewide policy isn't sort of a perfect fit for each individual utility. So there's always political attention around how these things work. And that's now expressing itself again in the form of challenges to I-937 in the legislature. And you know, the short thing to say about it is it's working. Utilities are all meeting their targets so far. It's creating a lot of jobs. It's creating a lot of clean energy. It's proving that we can continue this legacy of clean energy investment when we know that the alternative is to go backward toward more fossil fuel dependence. So we're optimistic that we can work through these things in the legislature. It's going to take a lot of determination on the part of the governor and the legislators who believe in a clean energy future to keep this law strong. And I think, you know, from the environmental side of this, we can see some potential changes to our clean energy legislation that make it better, more flexible, and accomplish more. And that's the key principle, because we're not interested in changing a law that's doing a lot of good right now unless we're going to change it in ways that allow us to shoot higher and get more work done. Because the climate crisis that we've been talking about means that these clean energy laws that we have are a good start, but we've got a lot more work to do.
Yeah. I want to do a quick critique of the tar sands thing. There's some people a lot of people, especially oil companies, want to extract oil from tar sands in the middle of Canada, and a lot of people recognize that it's just devastating to all parts of the ecosystems in that area, the water, people's health, wildlife, everything, and it's just bad in so many ways. And then the climate destruction from dealing with the tar sands oil is the extraction and processing and all that stuff is just horrible. When President Obama rejected the Keystone XL pipeline in mid-January, he emphasized that he wasn't deciding on the merits of it. He just said there wasn't enough time to do an environmental review. So, as you said a few minutes back, we may need to fight that one again. One of the things that has been interesting as a victory was the lawsuit about the oil refineries here in Washington. Tell us about. We have 5 oil refineries in Washington?
We do.
Tell us about Sierra Club's lawsuit.
And we are in partnership with the Washington Environmental Council. This is a really important cutting edge where we are starting to finally get some accountability. We have in Washington state declared that greenhouse gases are air contaminants, that they are a pollutant. And under our governing statute here for how we deal with our clean air, once we have determined that there is an air pollutant, we are obligated to create regulations to actually address the problem and reduce those emissions. Well, we've made the declarations, we have set goals for reducing those emissions, but we haven't actually created the rules to make it happen. And so this lawsuit is against the refineries to make the Department of Ecology create those rules that will actually get binding reduction on site within the refinery itself. We have 5 refineries here in Washington state, and they contribute about 6 to 8% of our state's greenhouse gas emissions. there are many on-site reductions that they could make for the refining of oil that they're not doing. And they won't do unless we have this binding rule in place that makes a very clear path of getting those reductions. So what we went to federal court and we said, our state plan is enforced by federal law. That's the way it works in all the states. And we went to the federal court and we said, our state is not enforcing laws that they have now incorporated into our federal obligation. So the federal courts have said, by golly, you're right. You do have to create rules and get to it. So that's now what the case is about. This is really interesting, and it's long overdue. If we have the goals, we have to make it meaningful, and this is a very clear step in going that right direction.
Huh. That's one of these things that I don't know if I had seen that in the press. It's the kind of thing where most people just don't pay attention, but it's important work that folks like you are doing behind the scenes, because the press doesn't report it adequately.
We did get some coverage when the judge made it. We were in there on the preliminary motions. The judge ruled in our favor. We're going to continue forward to go to court. It came out in early December. Really good decision from the federal judge. We're very excited about that. So now we're going to battle it out in court, and really the facts are stacked up in our favor, so we're very optimistic.
Okay, great. Let's talk about coal. There's a lot of coal that's getting burned in the world. Almost half is getting burned by China. The United States is second biggest user, followed by India. And then these three nations use altogether about 2/3 of the coal that's burned, at least as of 2010, based on what I was able to read. Here in Washington State, or here in Thurston County, Puget Sound Energy gets electricity from a coal plant in Montana called Coal Strip, among other sources. But people, I think, locally don't realize a lot of our electricity is gained by burning coal, which is a very nasty thing. Tell us about the coal export terminals that are being proposed for the coast, the Pacific coast.
There's two pieces to this. I'll ask Casey to take on the export, and I'll talk about the imported coal-based power, but let me frame it for you.
Yeah.
First of all, you're right. People have no idea how much coal that we use in this state, that we even had a coal plant in this state or a coal plant in Oregon. And we're right now at some very fundamental crossroads. And so I'll kind of set up a visual for you. Let's pretend that these are global warming emissions going out over time, and they've pretty much stabilized. If we allow these coal export terminals, the global emissions that we will be contributing to are going to be increasing significantly. We're going to be opening up the floodgates. This is the single worst thing that we could do in the Northwest to make climate change worse. So global emissions will go up. At the same time, we have to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and the single most important thing that we can do is to move beyond coal. So we have both coal coming and going, and we've got to address both pieces of it. You can't just do one.
And this is coal that's coming from Montana, Wyoming, that area, and they're looking for a place to basically export it out the Pacific and send it to China.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, the good news underneath that bad news is the reason that they're trying to get it to China is because Doug and so many other people are doing such a good job of making the transition away from coal toward clean energy here.
Yeah.
Over just last year, both Washington and Oregon made commitments to completely phase out the burning of coal in our states to produce electricity.
Yeah.
We still do, as Doug said, have coal in our power supply that gets imported over the wires, in effect, but still is burned for our power supply, and we have to keep phasing that out.
Yeah.
And we're doing it. We're making progress. We're reducing our coal consumption. We're replacing it with clean energy. And we're doing it more and more as a unanimous effort on the part of the communities where the coal plants are, the workers, the environmental groups, the businesses who are going to deliver the clean energy that replaces the coal. We've got a lot of consensus around that.
Yeah.
Well, so now if you're at the coal industry and you're sitting there up there in Montana with your coal, you're kind of holed up in the mountains and you got to figure out somewhere else to go. Where's the obvious place to go? To the big, fast-growing Asian markets.
Yeah.
That's why they're trying to export the coal, because those markets are growing and our market's shrinking. So it's a good thing that we're succeeding in shrinking our market.
Okay.
However, if all that coal that we're not burning, and 10 times more, goes through our railways, up the Columbia River Gorge, through our communities, through Olympia, right through downtown Seattle, and goes out to these coal export terminals and gets burned in China,
Yeah.
it bakes the planet every bit as effectively as if we had burned it ourselves.
Because a lot of the plants in China that burn coal are not very efficient, and so it puts perhaps more crud in the air than if we.
You can't
burned
burn
it here.
coal efficiently enough to get away.
Right.
We have
That's
to get
right.
off
That-
of coal.
exactly.
That's the
That's right.
only alternative.
Right.
We have to. We have to help the rest of the world do
Right.
it, and we're all in it together.
Right.
So I do want to say actually before I forget it. So there's a very important opportunity coming up in Olympia for viewers who are watching this before February 12th.
February 13th.
February 13th, thank you. There's a Coal Hard Truth Forum in Olympia, February 13th, 7 to 9 at the Olympia Center, where this community is going to have a great opportunity to learn about and weigh in on this idea. Yeah. These forums are happening all up and down the rail lines all over the region. Yeah. The bad news is the coal industry's got a lot of money to try to ram this down our throats.
Yeah.
The good news is people are coming out of their houses all over this region. Right. To resist this, to say what a bad idea it is, and to affirm that we've got a better idea about how to build strong communities and healthy economies and meet our energy needs. Yeah. So I'm optimistic that we're going to be able to fight this back, but it's going to take all the people power we can muster.
Right.
And it's one of the good examples where we have on the part of the fossil fuel industry a lot of organized money, and especially with Citizen United, the Supreme Court decision that allows even greater inflection of money into the political system. We're outgunned. But we have got the people, and this is where if you have organized people or organized money, I would go with organized people every time, and that's why we're going to win this fight.
Well, there's been progress in Bellingham. People have taken action through their city government to prevent coal trains from running through the city limits of Bellingham. And I know people in Longview and the other port communities have really come out to say, we don't want this.
Communities all over the region.
Reasons.
I will tell you, it's a discussion in some of those communities because the coal companies are prepared to provide some short-term jobs, building the coal facilities, and then a few long-term jobs, basically shoveling coal into the Asian industrial machine.
Yeah, but it's not that many jobs.
It's not that many jobs.
Not for the damage that it causes.
I do want to say it's very important, I think, for all of us to recognize it's not that many jobs, in a big number. But somebody is sitting in Longview and somebody's sitting in Bellingham right now who needs a job. Yeah. And for those people, you can very much understand how, even if they might like to have a better future, a better job than a coal export job, some job is better than none. And I think we have to respect that. I think the answer to that is continuing to prove every day in every community in the region that we really do have a better idea about how to produce energy, about how to produce jobs and prosperity than the coal companies do. That's not a hard case to make. Yeah. We're already proving that in communities everywhere. But we have to keep doing it. If we're really going to beat back coal export, we have to affirm what we're going to do to build those communities instead.
Yeah. One of the things that we know that Americans do rally behind, it was true in the State of the Union, it's been true in all the polling, is around clean energy. And right now, one of the really biggest sources that has primed that pump is the greatest success that we've had in the global warming fight as of late, and that is in the area of coal. 10 years ago, we were going to be building 150 new plants, and only a handful of those will ever get built. That was a huge success. Now we have already up to a commitment of almost 10% of the existing coal fleet is going to be phased out. Already we know that. And so every time that we do that, we are increasing and creating the market for this clean energy, which is directionally where everybody wants to go. So the coal campaign that we've seen across the country has probably been one of the really most successful campaigns we've had. But what we don't know is that it's right here in our backyard. And I would like to make that more real for folks. Puget Sound Energy, the utility for Thurston County, gets 30% of their power from coal. I'll bet you that the majority of your viewers had no idea.
Right.
And of that 30% that Puget Sound Energy gets from coal, of all the global warming pollution that we create in Washington State that comes from our electricity demand, because Puget Sound Energy is so dependent on coal, Puget Sound Energy alone accounts for 80% of all greenhouse gases in Washington State for electricity because of their coal. They have got this dirty old bucket of bolts in Montana that's going to be costing them hundreds and millions of dollars to upgrade, to make it just come into compliance with the most basic of environmental protections for air, water, and land. So the question for everybody right now, where do we want that hundreds of millions of dollars being spent? On dirty old outdated coal, or imagine if we redirected that hundreds of millions of dollars here in Washington State for clean energy. That is the fundamental choice. Which direction are we going to take? And that is so relevant right here.
Yeah. And that hundreds of millions of dollars is your energy bill. You're
You
writing.
bet.
We are all writing that
Well,
check. And the only question is which direction is that check going to go?
And in Thurston County, there's a new move afoot just as of January of 2012 to electrify our public utility district and produce electricity to buy out Puget Sound Energy's use of Thurston County. And if we were to do that as a publicly owned utility instead of one that's owned by private capitalists, largely in Australia and Canada and elsewhere, we would be entitled to get low-cost hydropower from the Bonneville Power Administration, which would significantly reduce our rates. We'd also have better local control of our electric utility because it would be run by local PUD commissioners, and we'd have local people doing the repairs and the billing and stuff. We'd have way better customer service, way better response to outages at storms and so forth, and just better consumer orientation. And we'd be able to use hydropower, and we could get rid of the coal entirely for Thurston County. And so there's a petition drive underway as of mid to late January.
Yes, we know of this. We're very interested. We're going to be watching closely.
It'll be fun to see how that goes. But that's
very
a way to
curious.
It's a way to get Thurston County off of coal.
Absolutely.
But let me just say, whether that wins or loses, whoever your energy supplier is, even if it's a publicly elected utility, we still have to hold electricity suppliers accountable.
Oh, absolutely.
For how they spend our energy
absolutely.
dollars. And
I'm just saying this is another route we can take, and another dimension of raising the issue in a way that would benefit consumers quite directly.
Yeah, that's right.
So, I know in the way of proposals, some people have proposed some really wacky things about trying some experiments, some geoengineering experiments to the atmosphere and seeing if they can do weird things. Could we mention that just briefly, what that kind of an approach is, and then I want to...
Well, what I can say from what little I know is that it does sound like a wacky idea and ungodly expensive. And if the point is to create mechanisms that can absorb carbon dioxide rather than just putting it into the atmosphere, we have that mechanism. It's called the boreal forests, where they're digging them up for the tar sands. It's called the rainforests of South America and Indonesia and Southeast Asia. And those rainforests and those boreal forests are 20% of the carbon in the world, because if they didn't exist, carbon emissions would go up by 20%. They play an enormously critical value already in absorbing carbon dioxide, yet we are clear-cutting the boreal forest for tar sands and wiping out the rainforest in the southern hemisphere at a very rapid rate. So if we want to do geoengineering, that would be a good place to start. Stop cutting doing that clear cutting and preserve those ecosystems that do it very efficiently.
Here in the Northwest, we have our own work to do on both forests and soils. Contain an enormous amount of carbon. We need to keep as much of that carbon as possible stored in natural systems, and we can store more. We've got an effort underway called the Northwest Biocarbon Initiative to do that, to help restore forest health and soil health, help small landowners, and keep more of that carbon in our soils and trees. And it's a very, very promising and important part of the solution, because the truth is there's too much carbon already up there. I mean, we got to reduce our emissions, and we got to pull more of it back down into natural systems.
We talked a bit earlier about people's attitudes and whether people are despairing or whatever. There's this sense, this old slogan that says, think globally but act locally, where the idea is try and figure out what you can actually do, what practical things you can do in your own life, in your own home, in your own community. And yet these problems, as we've said, are so big. And you've done a lot of thinking about the relationship between the personal level and the political level. And we are running tight on time, but I wonder if you could just kind of paint some directions or dimensions of that.
Yeah, well, just quickly, the two have to go together, right? I mean, when we first started working on this issue 20 years ago, we quickly realized people were hearing about global warming and it was freaking us all out. It was too big. And so we said, oh, well then let's make it small. So we all put on our website 10 things you can do to stop global warming, and people were screwing in their light bulbs, but after a while they started scratching their heads and coming back to us and saying, okay, I'm screwing in the light bulb, but that thing that Al Gore was talking about sounds really, really big. Are you sure that this is going to take care of that thing? Oh. And of course the answer is, if we're all screwing in our lonely light bulbs by ourselves, no, it's not a hopeful solution to climate. But all of these solutions help us build the case that solutions work. They help us build the businesses that deliver solutions. They help us build the habits and the cultures, whether it's driving less, whether it's using less energy, whether it's developing clean energy. Those are the kind of practices that have to be built here and all over the world. And the more we build them ourselves, the more hopeful and engaged we are, the more we set a precedent that spreads, the more that other people in the world who are wondering what the heck our federal government is doing take hope that Americans are going to be part of the solution. So it all feeds on itself. I don't want anybody to think that we're going to solve this through personal behavior changes alone. We have got to hold our governments accountable for bigger policy changes. And we've got to do the things within our own scope of effectiveness in our own lives that really make those solutions real on the ground. They have to go together.
And the common denominator on this gets back to that what we talked about and you just reiterated, despair. It has to start somewhere. We cannot wallow in the problem and think that we can't take it on. And in some ways, I must say, I really feel that's so un-American. For the big problems that we've taken on, we beat the Great Depression, we beat fascism in World War II. You know, we've done many things to take on huge problems that we, at the time, looked insurmountable. And part of me is like, well, this is what makes America great, is facing these great problems and being willing to take the cold, hard truth and move beyond it and get to solution. It starts with that action. And you will wallow in despair unless you take that action. So there's one level of screwing in the light bulb. There's another level of getting on your computer, going to climatesolutions.org, going to coalfreewashington.org, and getting engaged. Right. You sign in on those web pages. We will find a way for you to get out of despair that's meaningful.
And that's actually the next thing I want to do is see if we can get like a bit of information from you about the Sierra Club and what you're doing. You're doing some great stuff at the Seattle phone 206-378-0114, www.sierraclub.org, and then you have a Beyond Coal campaign at www.beyondcoal.org. Then here in Washington State, you've got www.coalfreewashington.org. So you're like right onto it.
You want to get engaged, we've got a venue for you.
Yeah, and I know Sierra
We'll
Club...
build you your own website.
Right, but Sierra Club has been around for a long time.
1892.
And you're like right up to the minute on these issues, so that's really great. Is there anything else you want to say briefly about Sierra Club? And then we'll talk about climate solutions.
Yes, the Beyond Coal campaign has been a great success for us in that, you know, we need the system approach to climate change. We don't have it right now. And so then what we have to do is to have to go after these big bad polluters one at a time. And it will be through that process of getting the worst and most egregious of these fossil fuel polluters, which are these coal plants, and start to transition them, that builds the momentum to get back to that national federal system. So we're on the path, and we need your help. We need people engaged. Yeah. Get on the website, get in touch with us, we'll get you engaged.
That's great. And climate solutions, many of us locally knew Atmosphere Alliance that had an office and some really wonderful people working in Olympia, and now you're Climate Solutions. And you folks have a Seattle phone, 206-443-9570, website www.climatesolutions.org. Then you have your Power Past Coal campaign at www.powerpastcoal.org. What else do you want to say about Climate Solutions, briefly?
Well, we are proud to be homegrown out of Olympia. We think of this as our headwaters.
Yeah.
We do now have offices in Seattle and Portland also. I know you've got some viewers in Oregon as well. And we are all about the clean energy revolution and making this transition from our fossil-fueled past to our clean energy future. We think the Northwest is the best place in the world to pioneer that transition. We think we have that opportunity and obligation as Northwesterners to lead that, to show what it looks like, to make it real in our communities, in our economy. And that's what Climate Solutions is all about. We are also, I want to tell you, some people kind of look around sometimes and think, gosh, there's lots of environmental organizations. How come there's so many? What do they all do? I'll tell you, I am just extremely grateful for our friends at the Sierra Club and the amazing work they do to make this all possible. We all work hand in glove. And the one other I'd mention for your viewers, some of them might know about 350.org at the national level where I serve on the board, that's just doing terrific work, was very instrumental in the Keystone Pipeline, is doing a lot of great movement building at the national level too.
Right, we have a couple of good national level things. One is www.350.org, and that's named after the number of parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's the limit before we go all
do the math.
haywire. Friends of the Earth does good work on this, www.foe.org. Ross Gelbspan, who's done some wonderful work on this stuff, has his essay Beyond the Point of No Return at www.heatisonline.org. And then Northwest Energy Coalition is a great coalition of a lot of good groups, very diverse groups, www.nwenergy.org. They're all good.
Yes, they are.
What would you each like to say as a closing thought? I would like to say that my dad told me a story about World War II where he was so amazed at the economic transformation that we could make with going from cars and trucks in Detroit to tanks and planes overnight, that he went to work for Detroit after the war. And I say, Dad, the magnitude of change we're taking on is at least that big. And he says, I know we can do it. I lived it. And people forget what the American spirit can do. And that is the biggest thing that I think it just behooves me. The opportunity here is at least as big as the crisis. And the most important thing is to get engaged. So please get on that computer, pick up that phone, give us a call. We will get you meaningfully engaged to move out of despair and help us in that journey to the clean energy revolution.
Thank you, Doug. KC.
What my brother Doug said. Francis Moore Lepay said that hope is a stance, not a calculation. And I know a lot of people are looking at the state of our federal government right now and shaking their heads and wondering how the heck we can ever do anything. And I have to tell you that I'm as frustrated as anybody about all that, and we've got to fix it. But in the meantime, we are living the solutions. We are creating the solutions. This is where the rubber hits the road. And the work that we're doing locally, in our states, in our lives, in our local economies, while we build the political constituency to take our federal government back from the fossil fuel interests, is vital work. It's the work we're going to have to do even after we get a national climate policy. So I urge everyone to be staying in that stance, to be working with us closely, to be making these solutions happen, and we'll build the political will. Our institutions will catch up with us at some point.
Great. Well, I want to thank Doug Howell and Casey Golden from the Sierra Club and Climate Solutions, respectively. I want to thank all the folks who've been watching. Since before the dawn of civilization, Earth's climate has allowed life to prosper and diversify, and we have plant and animal species that have evolved and adapted to the climate over millions of years. Human civilizations emerged and thrived. But now, in a very short time, humans are wrecking the climate, and many people around the world are horrified at the very disruptive and destructive future that lies ahead, unless we solve those problems. Scientists are largely in consensus about this reality, but some folks are dragging their feet through denial, through economic greed, and they are causing death sentences to be imposed upon species and among countless millions of people who will be suffering misery as a result. This is a damning indictment of our political and economic systems. Survival and civilization require radical changes to those suicidal political and economic systems. But we can solve the problems, as our guests have been repeatedly saying during this program. Nonprofit organizations, scientists, grassroots organizers, all kinds of people are pushing hard to change things, and we can do this too. Either we deal with reality or reality will deal with us. Solutions exist, but there's no time to waste. For information about the issues, contact the organizations we've been talking about. You can get information about other issues and activities through the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation, 360-491-9093. We're all one human family and we all share one planet. We can make the world a better place, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs you. Thanks.